There's nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes tells us that. There's nothing new under the sun. Does Satan take the same old tricks and rewrap it in new wrapping paper and make it look shiny and different? Sure. But at the heart of all sin is a failure to trust in the Lord. All of it. And you might say, well, I don't get that. The Lord has called us to walk a certain way before Him. That when we put our faith in the Lord, we will live a certain way. We will trust what He says is best. So, I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who, praise God, it's behind him, but he was an alcoholic for the longest time, and it brought all kinds of ruin on him and on his family. And all the stuff that he used to have, he doesn't have anymore. And one of the things that he said is, I know God called us to not do it, but I didn't believe Him. And I believed all the lies that were around us that go after this kind of lifestyle. And this is where the fun is. This is where the blessing is. This is where the good life is, right? Isn't there even a beer or alcohol company that calls, their slogan is, the good life? That's the lie. So do we trust the Lord and live by His way and find His blessings on His timing, or do we try to manufacture the blessings for ourselves by trusting in other things? I don't care what sin it is we deal with. At the heart of it, there's a failure to trust the Lord and what He says is best behind it. And so what you have in the kingdom of Israel and what you have today is you have some who choose to believe the Lord and walk with Him, and you have others who don't. And that comes to varying degrees at times. There is always a faithful remnant of people who walk with the Lord. Always. And it doesn't matter if the king is walking with the Lord or the king is worse than all the kings that came before him. There's always someone, there's always some group that is faithful to the Lord. Is it easy? No. And if you read the story of Israel, it's not even easy when there's a good king, because the people fail to trust the Lord. Even Asa, the good king, he was good, he did a lot of stuff, but he didn't remove the high places. And what did the Lord say to do? Tear down the high places. Don't do that. I want you to worship in my city. I want you to worship in Jerusalem. I want everybody to come together. That's a big deal. The writer of Hebrews says, let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. Why? Because we become isolated. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and he was using the image of how Satan works. He gets people isolated. We know this from military contexts. If you ever served in the military or did anything, thank you for your service. But one of the things that they keep drilling into people is, don't get out there alone. When you're traveling, when you're moving in units, you always watch for the guy in the back. Why? Because the enemy wants to snag that guy in the back and use him for leverage. And it's really easy to pick off the one guy who's out there by himself. We want to stay in groups. It's really easy to get picked off. And so what happens is Satan loves to just isolate people. Get them out here a little bit. And then get them out here a little bit. And what do? They lose hope. They lose faith. They start listening to something else. They start trusting in something else. And pretty soon, the enemy's got them. So that happens in Israel over and over again. And you see these little pockets of people who walk faithfully, and then they kind of get separated. And they kind of go their own way. And it's a heartbreak, but it's the way that Satan works today. More on that in a minute. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, the word that kept coming to mind over and over was division. And it's just like from the start, Satan was trying to divide Eve from fellowship with God. And it's like those things that sound so close to God, but just a little bit different. That's where I find people dividing on things, because most of the time when I'll hear arguments, whether someone's for this party or this thing or that, they're actually saying the same thing, but it's just that it's a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
for his kingdom. We need all, but it's like all these huge arguments in the world. When I listen to both sides, they're almost always saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. They are. Thank you for that. I used to do this more than I do now because it kind of fuels the wrong part of me. But there are occasionally you see them debates, on a certain topic, and you bring in a scholar on this side of the argument, and you bring in a scholar on this side of the argument, and they kind of debate it, and at the end of the night, everybody walks away and kind of has this idea of, whatever. That used to be way more popular than it is now. You get back in the 60s and 70s, and I mean, it was like, there were actually TV shows where they would bring on like religious scholars, and they just argue about stuff all day. I watched one of those, been several years ago at this point, and there was this guy they were both Christians, they both walked with Jesus, they were in different denominations. And I sat down and I made a list of what guy number A said. And I made a list of what guy number B said. And I started looking at them and I said, you know what? This and this are exactly the same thing. They're stating it differently, but it's the same thing. If you kind of, draw it out, they're saying the same thing. And their arguments flowed from those. And so where they got to, they were calling each other wrong, but they actually agreed on a multitude of things exactly the same. And it was like, you know what? You're using different language for the same thing. And because of that, you're not willing to worship together. You're not willing to praise together. And you're willing to argue each other publicly. Tell me how Satan works again. It's like, man. I'm not saying, you just go along to get along with everything that's happening. And that's obviously not what's happening in this story. But there's always people who walk faithfully with the Lord. There's always those people who get picked off. And sometimes there's more people that Satan's got distracted and fewer people. And sometimes it goes back the other way. More on that in a minute. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and much to what was just said. Satan did that when she was alone. She was by herself. And the motivator of that, in my opinion, and all through history, is fear. He separates us from everybody else, and when we're alone in our dark time, we're fearful, and that's where the false evidence appearing real becomes, and that's where Satan attacks.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you about that. And while you were saying that, I just thought about this. Jesus talks about how God works, and he's the good shepherd, right? He's the one who leaves the 99 to go find who is isolated. He's isolated. That's where you get into trouble. You have the oddest conversations with people, and isn't it cool how God kind of uses them? I had a conversation last night about a test that put rats on drugs. Never thought in a million years that was going to come into Bible class this morning, but it did. There was a test that was back, I think it was like during the 40s or the 50s, and it was a test with lab rats, and they were trying to figure out addiction and what makes people get on drugs. So they used lab rats. And they put water over here that was just water, and they put water over here with drugs in it. They put a rat in a box and just watched what they would do. And it was almost entirely these rats just kept going to the drugs. And it was just crazy. And they just said, well, there was a few rats that didn't, so it must just be something that's just wired into us, that you're either this way or you're that way. Nothing you can control, it just happens, right? Somebody finally looked at that study years later and said, that study wasn't done right, because the rats are isolated. There's one by itself, and they have nothing to do other than drink something. So they redid the study, and they put toys in there, and they put other rats in there. And so now they're not isolated, and then they put the drug water and the regular water in there. They put them loose, said, see what happens. And there were a few that kept going to the drug water, but they weren't like addicted to it. They weren't just like go whole hog on the thing. They don't know the difference, so they go to one, do whatever rats do when they're high. I don't know. And then they come down off of it and they're like, oh, okay, now I made that mistake again. The whole study totally flipped on its head, because what they found out is that when rats, and therefore people, have things to keep them busy, have support people around them, they don't drift away. They make better choices. They don't want to be strung out. There's a whole conversation there on how our society handles people who get addicted to something. We tend to isolate them. We pull them away from everything that they know and put them out here, and we isolate them again, and then we isolate. And then you wear that stigma that further isolates them. In community. I don't know how we got there, but in Israel, people do get isolated and get turned away, and their hearts chase after other things. So you've got King Asa in the south, who's doing a great thing. So what does God do when the nation is walking well with the Lord, and when things are going well, and they got a good godly king who's showing the ways of the Lord? Where does he send his prophet? Not there. He sends them to the people who are turning away from it. It's like that shepherd that goes out searching. And there's this widow who's about to starve to death, who's in isolation. And the Lord sends somebody into that situation. We talk about that in the sermon. And blesses. And it totally transforms. The next story after that is chapter 18, and I want you to watch what happens again. It's the same theme. Chapter 18. After a long time, in the 3rd year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. So Elijah's been up here in Zarephath in this Gentile region, has not been back down to the corrupt king, and now he's got to go. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Why? Because the Lord hadn't sent rain. Who is winning the God versus God battle here? Is it the Lord of Israel or is it Baal? P.S. If you weren't here for first service, you'll hear that in the sermon. This is a showdown between Baal and God, and more details on that in a moment. But watch this. Verse 3. Ahab had summoned Obadiah, his palace administrator. Now Obadiah was a devout believer in the Lord. While Jezebel was killing off the Lord's prophets, Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them in 2 caves, 50 in each, and had supplied them with food and water. Ahab had said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs and valleys. Maybe we can find some grass to keep the horses and the mules alive, so we will not have to kill any of our animals." So they divided the land they were to cover, and Ahab going in one direction and Obadiah in another. As Obadiah was walking along, Elijah met him. Obadiah recognized him, bowed down to the ground, and said, "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" "Yes," he replied. "Go tell your master Elijah is here." "What have I done wrong?" asked Obadiah, "that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be put to death? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you. And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear they could not find you. But now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah's here'? I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave here. If I go tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he's going to kill me. Yet I, your servant, has worshipped the Lord since my youth. Haven't you heard, my Lord, what I did while Jezebel was killing the prophets of the Lord? I hid 100 of the Lord's prophets in 2 caves, 50 in each, and supplied them with food and water. And now you tell me to go to my master and say, 'Elijah is here'? He will kill me." And Elijah said, "As the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I will surely present myself to Ahab today." So, there is Elijah talking to Obadiah, and we have this mutual exchange here. Elijah feels like he's the only prophet out there. Obadiah feels like he is the only guy out there. He's the only guy that's working to try to save stuff. He goes, you're going to send me back alone? I'm going to die. And Elijah goes, no, I'll be here. You can trust me. They're together. They're together in this. You do what you're supposed to do. I'm going to do what I said I'm going to do. We're going to do this together. So Elijah gets that feeling that, okay, there's 100 other prophets. But watch what happens. And Chris shares this in the communion meditation. Chris, did you know I was preaching for? Isn't it cool how God works? Chapter 19, which Chris references, and we're not going to go through too much. Look at chapter 19. Now, P.S., the end of chapter 18, there's this big showdown between Baal and 10 minutes. How to do the 10 minutes. Because there's like a semester and a half worth of material here. There's a thesis. My thesis is that the Lord reigns and Baal does not. That's what the whole showdown is about. There's so much cool detail there. Okay, let's. I'm going to do this quickly and then get back to my point. Please remind me to get back to my point. Can somebody do that? Okay. All right. Baal is the god of rain and the storm, the thunder, the lightning. What is lightning? Okay, it's electricity, right? Give it to me before Ben Franklin discovers electricity. What is lightning? Fire that comes from where? From the heavens, right? It's fire from the heavens. Who do the Canaanites, who do these people in Samaria say the God who controls fire from the heavens is? It's Baal. He's the God that sends rain. He's the guy that sends fire. So everybody's praying for rain like crazy, right? It's a 3-year drought. Elijah said there's going to be a 3-year drought. If everybody's praying for rain and the showdown is rain, who wins? I mean, it's debatable, right? It's totally debatable. So what Elijah does is he shows up and he's going to have this final showdown to show once and for all who is the true God of everything. And he does it with the other part of their resume. We've already established rain. You guys keep praying to Baal, there's no rain. You're going to watch in a minute. I'm going to pray and it's going to work. But I'm going to show you how it works here. We're going to take an altar and we're going to sacrifice. You guys pray to Baal, who sends lightning, fire from the sky. We're going to see what he does. Then I'm going to pray to my God, who you guys say doesn't control fire from the sky, and we're going to see what he does. We're going to see who wins that, and then that will determine who's going to send rain. They pray, they cut themselves, they, oh, Baal, send the fire, send the fire. You know. Do I share the hilarious kind of off-color thing that's in Hebrew? Baal is taunting the prophets, right? Elijah, excuse me. Elijah is taunting the prophets of Baal. I'll keep it as simple as possible. One of the taunts he says is, shout louder. Maybe your God is going to the bathroom. Maybe he couldn't hear you because he's struggling. He's going to potty. Just keep shouting, you know. All kinds of taunts like that. Nothing happens. So then Elijah takes the most valuable resource in the land at that moment. Gold doesn't matter. Silver doesn't matter. Horses don't matter. What matters in a 3-year drought? And he dumps it all on top of that. Says, hey, God, fire, and it burns up everything. Who wins? The God of Israel. So then, who can we assume sends the rain after that? There you go. So, after that happens, Chapter 19, now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets of, that's Baal, with the sword. P.S., what does Elijah do? Exactly the same thing that Jezebel did. Jezebel has killed all the prophets. So what does Elijah do? Kills all the prophets. We often forget about this in the Egypt story. There are so many parallels between the Moses and Exodus story and the Elijah story. So many. The miraculous feeding in the wilderness, the miraculous stuff like that, the showdown between the gods of Egypt, all the plagues attack a god of Egypt. Who's the real God? It's the God of Israel. You get down to this moment, and the death of the firstborn, and we think, man, what a horrible plague God sends on. What plague did Pharaoh send on Egypt to start the whole mess? He killed all the firstborn males. It's simply what they did. I hate to use the phrase what goes around comes around because it sounds like karma, and that's not what I'm saying. What God has done is He's given them what they've asked for. And so He gives Jezebel what she asked for. All these prophets that sit around her table, that are her buddies, that are leading the world astray, they're dead now. You've done that to the Lord, now it's come back to you. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them. In other words, you're going to die by the sword too. So Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. What is he now? Isolated. He is isolated. And he came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. P.S. Do you remember when Moses did the same thing? Moses prayed that same prayer. God, just kill me now. Just take me out. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals. P.S. Fire is one of those presence of God things. Where did the hot coals come from? It's just there. And a jar of water, and he ate and he drank and he lay down again. P.S. You ever just feeling really rotten? Take a nap and eat something. It's biblical. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up, eat, for the journey is too much for you. In other words, you're not going to stay here. This is not your fate. You're not going to stay here. You need to go. And I'm providing you fuel to get there. So he got up, he ate and drank, and strengthened by that food, he traveled for 40 days and 40 nights. Did Moses ever do anything for 40 days and 40? Okay, you get the point, right? Okay. And he reached the mountain of God. And so now there's this thing where you've got the prophet of God on the mountain with God, asking to talk to God and to see God. The point I promised I would get back to. It's easy for us to get isolated. It's easy for us to get in our own little mind and think we're all alone. I want you to watch what Elijah says here. This is down in verse 9.5 and 10. And the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing? Why are you here by yourself? Why are you fleeing? Haven't I provided for you? Haven't I taken care of you? Haven't I given you direction? Haven't I been with you all the way through this? What are you doing here? And Elijah says, I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant. They've torn down your altars. They've put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left. What's wrong with that? It's not true, is it? Who did he talk to before he did his whole showdown thing? Obadiah. How many other prophets are there? There's 100 other prophets and Obadiah in the king's palace and Elijah. And now he's let himself get isolated and he goes, they've killed everybody else. I'm the only one. You ever felt like you're the only one? Let that be a sign that you're isolated. Do not give up meeting together. Elijah's a great prophet. He does great and wonderful things. But he gets so isolated and so torn down and so beat down. When we are alone, we're vulnerable. When we're alone, the lies of the enemy start making sense to us. When we're alone, we fear. And what is it that the Lord says over and over and over again? Do not be afraid, for I am with you. The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Remember that from last week? He leads me beside still waters. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid. Why? For you're with me. I'm not alone. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a feast before me in the presence of my enemies. Isn't it cool how the Bible just keeps talking about itself over and over again? It's written in 3 languages on 3 continents by over 40 authors over the span of some 4,000 years. And yet it amazingly ties one story together of one God who works through all kinds of people in all kinds of places to bring His one and only Son so that anyone who believes in Him, all y'all who believe in Him,